Up to this point, the data we've needed has always been stored in a single dataset. However, that won't always be the case. At times, you may need to combine data from multiple agencies in order to complete your analysis. Additionally, large studies often gather data at multiple sites, or over long periods of time. When this happens, it's not uncommon for observations for the sites or times to be stored as separate datasets. Another common scenario in which you end up with multiple datasets for the same study is when researchers use different datasets to record the results of different survey instruments or different groups of similar instruments. In any of these cases, you may need to combine data from across datasets in order to complete your analysis. This combining of data comes in two basic forms: combining vertically and combining horizontally. First, you'll learn about combining vertically, or adding observations. Later, you'll learn about combining horizontally, or adding variables. Here you have two separate datasets, dataset 1 and dataset 2. In this case, both datasets contain the exact same variables, var1, var2, and var3. However, they aren't identical because they contain different observations. Now you want to combine these datasets and end up with one dataset that includes the observations from dataset 2 listed directly below the observations from dataset 1. In this module, you'll learn three different methods for combining datasets vertically: appending, concatenating, and interleaving. To choose the best way to combine your data, you'll need to understand the structure and contents of your input datasets. When combining datasets vertically, one of the most important questions to ask is, do the datasets have variables in common? Just by examining dataset 1 and dataset 2 here, you can see that the variables have the same names. How can you check to make sure that the variables also contain the same type of data? You can use the contents procedure to view and compare the descriptor portion of the two datasets. Sometimes you might find that the variables that have different names across datasets contain the same data. For example, suppose that dataset 1 has a variable named ID and dataset 2 has a variable named subject ID. In this situation, you might want SAS to combine these two variables when you combine datasets. On the other hand, you may find that variables that have the same name across datasets actually contain different data. For example, both datasets here contain the variable date, but one date variable might store birth date and the other might store date of admission. You would not want SAS to combine these two variables. As you may have guessed, when combining datasets vertically, it's easiest to combine datasets that have identical variables. However, you will also learn how to combine datasets that have different variables. Now let's compare the methods of combining datasets vertically. We'll start with appending and concatenating, which have many similarities. Both of these methods place the observations from one dataset after the observations from the other dataset in a single dataset. Additionally, in both methods, the observations in the combined dataset are stored in the same order that they occurred in the original separate datasets. However, there are also differences between appending and concatenating. These two methods can have different results and different limits on the number of datasets you can combine at once. When you append, you can work with only two datasets at a time. When concatenating, you may combine observations from two or more datasets. Appending adds all the observations in the second dataset directly to the end of the first dataset. When you append, the first dataset gets larger. You do not create a new dataset. Here's a situation in which you would append datasets. Suppose you're working on a multi-site clinical trial recruiting participants from Chicago, San Diego, Denver, and Fort Worth over multiple years. You have a dataset named trial that stores the number of participants recruited each year, as well as the percent of participants who are male. Another dataset named trial_2014 was just sent to you with the recruitment numbers for the year 2014. You want to add observations about the participants recruited in 2014 to the master dataset so that it contains information about all years. To do this, you append the trial_2014 dataset to the dataset trial. Here is the general form of the append procedure. Remember that proc append adds the observations from one dataset to the end of another dataset. You specify both datasets in the proc append statement. Base equals names the dataset to which observations are added. Data equals names the dataset containing the observations you want to add. In a proc append step, you can specify only two datasets. Now watch this demonstration of appending SAS datasets.
Before you append the datasets, take a look at both of them. Here you have the dataset advisees already open in the View Table window. Advisees contains three variables: first name, gender, and year of matriculation into the program. Here's a question: how many observations are currently in advisees? There are currently 3 observations in the dataset advisees. Now take a look at the dataset advisees 2012. As you can see, advisees 2012 has the exact same variables as advisees and 3 observations. When you add the 3 observations in advisees 2012 to the 3 observations in advisees, the dataset advisees should contain 6 observations. Here is a proc append step. The proc statement specifies advisees as the base dataset and advisees 2012 as the data equals dataset. You also want to add a proc print step so that the output shows advisees after the 2012 students are added. When you look at the log, SAS tells you that advisees now has 6 observations and 3 variables. In your list report, you can see the 3 advisees added in 2012 at the end of the advisees dataset. But what happens when the dataset you want to append does not have the exact same variables as your base dataset? Here are your 2013 advisees. Notice that advisees underscore 2013 and advisees share 2 variables, first and matric. However, advisees has 1 variable that advisees 2013 does not have, gender. So here's a question: how many variables will advisees have after you append advisees underscore 2013? When you submit your code and view the log, SAS tells you that it couldn't find the variable gender in the data equals dataset. It also tells you that advisees still has 3 variables, but now has 8 observations. What value do you think SAS assigned for gender in the 2 observations from advisees 2013? SAS added the 2 observations from advisees 2013 to the end of advisees and set the value of gender for those observations to missing. This is because SAS cannot change the variable information in the descriptor portion of the base dataset. This means that the base dataset will always have the same number of variables before and after appending. Now try one more scenario using proc append. Here are your 2014 advisees. In 2014, you did not record gender, but you did record program. Therefore, advisees 2014 and advisees share 2 variables, first and matric. But advisees has 1 variable that advisees 2014 does not, gender. Additionally, advisees 2014 has 1 variable that advisees does not, program. So, how many variables do you think advisees will have when you submit this program? As before, you check the log first. This time you see a warning indicating that the variable program was not found in the base dataset. You also have an error message this time telling you that SAS did not append advisees 2014. However, SAS also tells you that you can force SAS to append the dataset by using the force option in the proc step. Here is the proc append step one more time, but this time it includes the force option. Let's see what happens when you use the force option. So, SAS added Nathan and Gloria to the bottom of the advisees dataset, but dropped the variable program. When you look at the log, SAS tells you that when you use the force option, variables not found in the base equals dataset are dropped or truncated. So, the advisees dataset ends up with 10 observations and the same 3 variables it began with.
In this video, you learned how to append 2 datasets using the append procedure. Next, you'll learn some alternative methods for combining SAS datasets vertically.